So, let me take you on a little journey then, having briefly introduced some of what I do, who I am, a little bit, I want to entertain you with some mind-expanding considerations. And these are metaphysical aspects of life. The first premise, the precept that it is founded upon is the paradigm that we live in a conscious universe. According to the materialistic Western model, we do not. We live in a universe from which consciousness emerged from matter somehow. I'm going to show you that is about as ludicrous an idea as one could possibly imagine, but it's exactly what we're being sold. And that word sold, I could have said told, but we're being sold. And it sounds a little harsh in terms of a corruption, but there's a lot of, in the marketplace, that, reality of business and sales and consumerism, and most of us don't mind having things. It's great, right? Having stuff, technology, comfort, homes, it's wonderful. It's a beautiful thing. However, it does still leave us with all of our stuff. We're still missing things. What's more important than stuff is to feel healthy, happy, centered, basically. But even deeper than that is what's called self-actualization, where we feel like I know who I am, I know why I'm here, I feel on purpose, I have passion, and it's working. That's a nice thought, right? Because we can have all of the above, but might not be working. So we live in a conscious universe. And the conscious universe lends itself to an ancient spiritual notion that the one sound, the one light, what is called the sounding light, pervades the universe. It's in the Bible, in the beginning was the Word. Remember that phrase? In the Bible, yeah. That principle is a metaphysical, esoteric principle. So the notion of the one sound, one light pervading the universe, which is also translates as one song, and it also pervades all the dimensions, which is called the omniverse. So this is where we get into the beginning of metaphysics, where we realize there's a multidimensional universe. We are multidimensional. We have a physical body, an etheric body, an astral body, a mental body. It's our auric field. And our subconscious mind, by the way, is in that auric field. So the subconscious mind's not somewhere deep in your brain. That's just the CPU unit. That's this. But it's as though this computer is the brain, but the internet is what would be called the collective mind, and even the electricity would be the spirit, because it doesn't matter that this won't last. The electricity still is there. So you have metaphors. All creations made by humanity are imitations of nature, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's fine for us, because after all, the greatest compliment is emulation, if you like. But it's also just simple practicality. We create electricity to have lights, where in the past was fire. Anything that illuminates. In any case, this deep ancient notion that division and separation are ultimate illusions comes into the deeper story. Now this notion of oneness and separation and division are illusions is based in the term holism. The root of holism lends itself to holy. In religious traditions, we tend to think of emotional energy, and we tend to think of dogmatic, kind of vague, Father knows best attitudes, especially from the West. But actually, all deep, serious religions have a science in them, and the science is the metaphysical science. Now, this is an example of that, what is described in this image as the involution of spirit into matter, culminating on earth. We have the physical, astral, mental, causal. The causal would be deemed the realm of the soul. So these things aren't easily measurable, I appreciate. They're not quickly, obviously, easily demonstrable. And that's where the scientific model steps forward and says, well, you can't prove that. But the proof is quite circumstantial, which I'll show you. And there are a lot of various ways in which these things can be proven. But once that type of those types of answers are presented, they're often rejected because there's, quite frankly, the modern day science at worst presents itself as sort of its own religion. It's become it's become rather stiff and rigid in its adherence to various principles which are fundamentally empirical conclusions. You understand that? In other words, if I can't use my senses to perceive it, therefore we have to assume it's not real. But the evidence of it, the circumstantial evidence, is everywhere. So, in this model, the moon in astrology represents the etheric principle. And the etheric this is just an image of the fact that the etheric is considered and measured as a web. I think in physics they refer to this branch of, in quantum physics they refer to what's called the string theory. Ever heard of string theory? String theory is when you get into the deep reaches of the molecular and there's this weave that sits behind the fabric of creation. And this has long been understood as the etheric. The etheric web is otherwise described as a transceiver. It both receives from an inner... This is where it gets esoteric. It receives from an inner plane of existence, interdimensionality, but it also receives from us. It's a two-way street. Transceiver. So we also see that the planet Earth, by the way, would also be understood to have layers of dimensionality to it. Now, we're not talking about the atmosphere. The atmosphere is another way of measuring this, but this metaphysical model suggests that the Earth too has an aura. Now, this is an ancient model, by the way, of where we live in this world, but we peer into another, and we peer into other levels of reality. This just presents a basic platform, a basic model that the everyday world here is what we see and perceive with our senses, which is wonderful. But if we were to more or less what is called peel away the veil, it's not just ghosts and disembodied souls, but that would be one kind of veil. But if we peeled away another kind of veil, we would get to more or less what you would see in a different respect, as if you took off the lid on the computer and you saw the guts in the machine. There's guts to the machine. You could say it in a very coarse kind of manner, but it celebrates that there's some weavings of intelligence, and they're always layered. Everything has layers, just as we have hair, skin, muscle, bone, circulatory system, and we can talk about other various subtle systems in our body, the organs, of course. And even the skin has layers, and the bone has layers. So there's layers upon layers upon layers upon layers. So there's an inner intelligence in that, and of course that's what science studies, but metaphysics does as well. So this ancient statement and these images, what's really exciting among other things about the images I'm showing you, by the way, is that when you start to do some investigation into these various subjects, you realize that there's people everywhere, all over the world, artists, offering renditions of this ancient knowing. So this is what has been classified as the New Age, which I like to refer to as the New Ancient. The New Ancient, the ancient model of reality presents surprising understanding. So the tendency of our modern age is to think that we've gotten smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter. That's a linear model. But actually, some of our ancient forebears knew things and had wisdom and so forth that we are just rediscovering. So it's not quite a linear model that way. Can you appreciate that? It would be seen in a more cyclic sense. Time measured linearly is what they call the arrow of time. But metaphysics says, well, actually all time should be measured cyclically. And it makes so much more sense. Everything's going around from the molecular to the cosmic. And our clocks and calendars are based on cycles. So to measure time in a linear fashion is kind of a funny thing that we do. And this is how it becomes. There's a lot of hypothesis and sort of various degrees of assumption that go into our everyday communications. Even, one could talk, you can put a letter, or you could put a number up on the chalkboard, shall we say, and it itself represents a certain premise of understanding that we agree upon. But if you dig in there, you realize, oh, there's a whole world behind that. So, and how much time do we have to spend rehashing fundamentals? However, the main point is we build massive concepts and great theories, but they are often built on various stepping stones and assumptions too. So we have to agree. So there's a certain agreement factor. And so long and short, no matter what we as humanity have come to understand in terms of knowledge, there's this tendency within humanity to always be reconsidering it, which is a good thing. Reconsidering, and in our reconsiderations, we come to realize, oh, there's some very ancient understandings that are really beautiful. So one of them is that this notion, and a lot of these little wisdom sayings come out of religious texts. So my interest is not to promote any particular religious text at all, but to recognize that the ancient religious texts carried all various sorts of knowledge and insight and understanding. They were meant to be sort of, some people call them the first self-help books, moral guides, what to do, what not to do, what constitutes wisdom. But woven within them was little esoteric messages. And this book would be the popular book, but if you went to where was the book written, you'd find yourself in a library, of course. And then you would expand upon all of those aphorisms, and you'd come into what would be not just literature, but forms of science. So now, if we're made, we're made in the image of God. We can say goddess. Now the reason I say that is largely because Mother Nature. We are made of the stuff of nature, which is something that has been said since the beginning of time, and science has also grabbed hold of that. We'll say we're made of the stuff of stars and all this wonderful truisms that come out of all this understanding. So that we are multidimensional, creative, and divine are three basic ways of defining how we're made in the image of nature. So we're not merely dust to dust kind of thinking. That we're made in the image of nature suggests that nature is multi-layered, multidimensional, creative, and divine. A simple way of putting it is to look at it this way. That nature is conscious, intelligent, creative, loving, intentional, purposeful, cooperative. Those seven words are seven beautiful words that suggest guidelines about who we are and how we would ideally conduct ourselves. We'd be conscious and intelligent, creative and loving, intentional and purposeful, and cooperative. A nice, beautiful, simple seven. And we look at nature and we realize it works that way. So it may be said that the entire universe constitutes... Now what we're looking at, by the way, this is a bit of a jump, but we're looking at the human being is made in the various ways it is in our brain. This would represent brain synapses, but actually what you see, this image of this sort of transparent image of this person, this humanoid being, what you're seeing behind it is the whole universe at a very wide angle. So it's a beautiful understanding of the whole universe at a very wide angle. Shows streams and streams and streams of galaxies which mirror in an approximated way how the brain synapses work in our own brain. So it's just a poetic leap of sorts, but the notion is that we're made in the image of nature, of God, if you like, where nature is a manifestation of something powerful, something creative. The sun within this model now, the sun is not simply a thing in space. From a different perspective of understanding, by the way, and so we step closer to this, and then we're jumping quickly, I appreciate, but just the fact that astrology is based on the sun, right? That we start with your sun sign, or the first star to consider is what your sign is. If you're born as a Cancer, or Aries, or Pisces, or wherever you are, that's your sun sign. Now the sun, in this regard, is not merely an object in the sky, because we actually, by the way, there's a few ways of looking at this. One of them is that the sun is an intelligence. It's like as we refer to Gaia as a being, the sun is an intelligence within nature. In some traditions, they call it a cosmic or a solar lord. Some of the language in various traditions gets emotional. To call it a lord is its own type of emotionalism. But the main point is, just as we refer to in ancient traditions as the sun as Helios, Ra, in the Egyptian tradition. Helios would be in the Greek tradition. Surya would be in the Vedic tradition. They have a name for the sun. They don't just call it an object, sun, thing. They call it a person. This is an ancient sun worship. Now, the sun, or any star, is a focal point, and it would be deemed of divine, conscious, creative intelligence. Now, I say that to you partially because of how astrology works. So there's a lot to be said about that, that we jump from this understanding of seeing the sun as a thing, an object in the sky, to recognizing there's more to it than that. There's an inner intelligence, and it becomes a focal point of this higher, deeper intelligence. And that's where the notions of the words, and we've been talking about it right from the beginning, metaphysical, esoteric, those words you hear that open up a door, occult. Metaphysical, esoteric, and occult enter a world that's different than our mainstream model of reality. But it becomes one where there's a notion of spirituality, where we realize there's this principle of being one in it, one with it, and there's a sense of wanting to commune with it. How do you commune with nature? Aside from enjoying sitting by the river or under a tree or by a fire or being in the fresh air or in nature in any way, there's forms of communion which are really wonderful. Nothing wrong with that. But in the deeper sense, you can get in, this is where astrology starts to come forward and says, well, the notion of your nature, your earth, air, fire, and water, is based on an ancient science where humanity, people from all cultures would look at nature and recognize there's very fundamental principles here. There's earth, air, fire, and water, and there's cycles, and there's the moon waxing and waning, and so they would observe how people would be born at certain times of the year with certain planetary alignments and so forth, and they begin to notice patterns. That's how it all works. That's the science. So, there's a lot in that. There's a lot to, this very quick jump through a metaphysical model just to give you a taste that it's based on that. That's all I want to do, because there's a lot more elaboration, of course, one could get into.